In the quiet folds of Tamriel's history, before the name Tiber Septim was whispered in reverence, there was a child whose origins seemed stitched together from two realms, the mundane and the mythic. His birth was not recorded with the pomp of royal heraldry, nor was it marked in the ledgers of the great cities. Instead, it was spoken of in campfire murmurings and hushed speculation among those who knew the shifting tides of fate. Some say he was born in Atmara, that frozen cradle of ancient heroes, where the winds carry the echoes of Iskermor's 500 companions. Others insist his first cries were heard in the rugged hills of High Rock, in a village so small that its name has long been swallowed by time. Whatever the truth, both tales agree that from his earliest days, the boy carried with him an aura, not of noble blood, but of inevitable destiny. The winters of his youth were harsh, shaping his body with the unforgiving discipline of survival. He learned to read the language of storms, the way the clouds would darken like the brows of angry gods, the way snow could blind as easily as steel. In the summers, he roamed, listening to the songs of traveling bards who wove together the sagas of men and mare. These stories planted seeds in his heart, not only of conquest, but of unity, of bringing scattered peoples beneath a single banner. Yet even as a child, he seemed to understand that unity was not a gift freely given. It was something earned through will, cunning, and, if necessary, the edge of a blade. His earliest mentors were not kings or generals, but wanderers, soldiers for hire, and weathered sailors whose skin had been salted by 100 seas. From them, he learned the craft of the sword, the strategy of patience, and the necessity of adapting to an ever-changing world. More importantly, he learned the art of listening, not just to words, but to the tremors beneath them. Even in youth, he could sense when a man's boast was hollow or when a woman's quiet gaze carried the weight of truth. The land itself seemed to test him, as if aware of the role he would one day play. A river, swollen by spring thaw, tried to sweep him away when he was still small enough to vanish beneath its surface. He fought the current and lived. Wolves once circled him in the deep pine forests. Instead of running, he faced them with a burning branch in each hand, driving them back with a defiance that would become his trademark. These were not mere accidents of boyhood, but crucibles, shaping not only his skill, but his unshakable belief that he was meant for something far greater than the life into which he had been born. There are whispers, still, of omens surrounding his early years. A hawk landing upon the roof of his family's home and refusing to leave for 3 days. A sudden eclipse that darkened the sky while he was out hunting. A traveling Redguard seer who, upon meeting the boy's gaze, muttered a prayer under her breath before turning away. None of these moments were recorded in the annals of official history. Yet in the minds of those who witnessed them, they became early proof that the divines themselves had cast their gaze upon him. And so, the child of two worlds, whether of Atmar and Ice or Breton Hills, began to walk the path toward legend. The boy would grow into the man who united the Empire, but in these first quiet chapters of his life, he was simply learning the lay of the land, testing his strength against the wilds, and listening for the call of destiny that seemed to echo faintly in every gust of wind. The world did not yet know his name, but already Tamriel was shifting in subtle ways, as though preparing itself for the weight of the crown that would one day rest upon his brow. The rivers that once tried to drown him would carry his ships. The wolves that once tested his courage would become the enemies who underestimated him. His life was a tapestry still being woven, each thread leading inexorably toward the moment when the boy of uncertain birth would become the emperor of all. The boy who once roamed forests and braved the fury of mountain storms did not remain in obscurity for long. As he reached the cusp of manhood, his talents, tempered by hardship and sharpened by an unshakable will, drew the notice of men whose business was war. The northern coasts, ever prone to raids from seaborne marauders, provided him his first taste of organized battle. He joined a local militia not out of loyalty to a lord, but because it offered him the greatest crucible, the test of steel against steel, mind against mind, will against chaos. Even among seasoned warriors, the young man's presence was undeniable. He was not the tallest, nor the strongest, but his eyes carried a focus that unsettled even hardened veterans. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words carried weight, delivered with the certainty of someone who had already measured the outcome of a fight before the first blow was struck. This ability to see the battlefield not just as a place of violence, but as a living puzzle, earned him quiet respect long before he held any formal rank. His first command came not through ceremony, but through necessity. During a skirmish against a band of raiders, the malicious captain fell to an arrow in the throat. Panic threatened to splinter the defense, but the young warrior stepped forward, barking orders with the clarity of a man who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. He shifted the line, used the terrain to funnel the enemy into a narrow pass, and turned what could have been a slaughter into a decisive rout. When the fight ended, the men looked to him instinctively, not because anyone had told them to, but because his presence had already filled the void of leadership. From that day, he was no longer just a fighter. He was a commander. The next campaigns came swiftly, skirmishes along disputed borders, suppressing uprisings in isolated hamlets, guarding trade routes vital to local lords. In each, he displayed a gift for understanding the enemy's mind, predicting movements not through guesswork, but through a deep intuition that seemed almost preternatural. If his foe struck quickly, he was already moving to counter. If they waited, he waited longer, wearing their patience thin until they made the first fatal mistake. But it was not only strategy that drew men to his side. It was his ability to make them believe. He spoke to them not as pawns in a lord's ambition, but as partners in a shared cause. He ate from the same pot, walked the same mud-slick roads, and took watch in the cold night air. Even those who served only for coin found themselves following him into battles where the pay was meager, but the cause felt greater than themselves. It was during this time that his name began to ripple outward, carried by the tongues of traders, mercenaries, and wandering bards. Stories spread of a commander who could rally broken lines, who saw victory where others saw ruin. Some dismissed the tales as exaggeration. The usual war camp legends spun from ale and idle hours. But those who had fought beside him knew the truth, that his victories were not accidents of fortune, but the deliberate shaping of fate itself. Yet, for all his rising renown, he remained restless. Each victory, each secured border, felt like a prelude to something larger. He could feel the pull of destiny more strongly now, like a storm building beyond the horizon. There was a sense that the skirmishes and minor campaigns were mere practice for a conflict that would shake the foundations of Tamriel itself. It was during a lull between campaigns that he met the men who would shape the next chapter of his rise. Lords with eyes set on uniting fractured provinces, generals weary of endless border wars, and visionaries who believed in an empire reborn. They saw in him not only a skilled tactician, but a figure who could inspire armies and bind kingdoms beneath a single banner. And though he was still far from the imperial throne, the path toward it had begun to unfold, each step marked by the same relentless will that had carried him from the rivers and forests of his youth into the command tents of seasoned warriors. The young general was no longer a nameless wanderer. He was a rising force, a gathering storm. And soon, the whole of Tamriel would feel the first tremors of the empire he would forge. The young general's victories had drawn attention far beyond the borders of his home. Messengers arrived bearing sealed letters, their wax imprints marked with crests from distant holds and provinces. Lords and war chiefs, once strangers, now sought his counsel. Some came with offers of coin and command, others with warnings, thinly veiled in polite words, urging him to stay within his own lands. Yet beneath every invitation and threat lay the same truth. They all recognized his rising influence, and they either wished to wield it or to curb it before it grew beyond their control. It was during a season of uneasy peace that the first great turning point came. Two neighboring lords, locked in a bitter feud for generations, had reached a stalemate neither could break. Raids burned farms and villages along the borderlands. Trade withered, and the people suffered under the endless tit-for-tat retribution. Both sides, unwilling to yield but weary of constant war, sent discreet envoys to the young general. They asked not for a champion to fight their battles, but for an arbitrator, someone who might craft a peace where none had existed for centuries. The general saw more than an opportunity to end needless bloodshed. He saw the seed of something larger. If he could unite two entrenched enemies under a single cause, even temporarily, he could prove that the old divisions of Tamriel were not immutable. The path to a greater unity, an empire of many peoples, might begin here in the quiet halls of negotiation rather than on battlefield. He traveled to the borderlands himself, refusing the safety of a large retinue. His arrival was met with suspicion on both sides, but he did not falter. Over the course of many nights, in torchlit halls and open fields, he spoke to the leaders not in the language of diplomacy's hollow courtesies, but in the blunt, unvarnished truth of a soldier who had seen enough war to know its futility. He listened to their grievances without interruption, asking sharp questions when he sensed half-truths, and slowly, piece by piece, began weaving their disparate needs into a vision they could both accept. The agreement he brokered was simple in form, but revolutionary in spirit. The two lords would maintain their autonomy, but pledge mutual defense against external threats, pool certain resources for trade, and open their borders for free passage of merchants and travelers. Each would gain more in prosperity than they had ever claimed through conquest. The pact was sealed not with elaborate ceremony, but with a shared feast where former enemies broke bread together for the first time in living memory. News of the alliance spread quickly, whispered in markets, and carried along trade roads. To some, it was a curiosity, a rare peace between stubborn foes. To others, it was a warning, for if this young commander could mend such an old rift, there was no telling what else he might unite. The general understood the power of symbols. He ensured that the first caravan traveling under the new pact flew banners from both realms, side by side, for all to see. The sight of it stirred something in the hearts of common folk. The possibility that the endless patchwork of rival territories might one day become a single tapestry. And yet, he knew this fragile alliance was but the first stone in a long and treacherous road. Other lords would resist, jealous of their power, clinging to rivalries that had defined their lineages. Some would try to lure him into their service, hoping to bend his rising reputation to their own designs. Others would plot his downfall in secret, fearing the change he represented. But the young general welcomed the challenge. The fire of ambition burned hotter now, tempered by a vision that stretched beyond borders and beyond lifetimes. If two sworn enemies could be made to fight side by side, then so could provinces, kingdoms, perhaps even the whole of Tamriel. And so he began to travel further afield, seeking not just to win battles, but to win trust. With each alliance, he was not merely gathering strength. He was shaping the first fragile threads of what would one day become the vast imperial web. The wheel of history had begun to turn, and with it, the legend of Tiber Septim was beginning to take its first true form. The road to Sancre Tor wound through rugged hills and ancient forests, the air carrying the scent of pine and stone. Few traveled here willingly, for the fortress was more than a relic of the past. It was a place of legend, its stones steeped in the victories and tragedies of long-dead heroes. The young general had heard the tale since childhood, that Sancre Tor was the heart of the old Reman Empire, a place where warriors swore oaths that bound not only their lives, but their very souls to the fate of Tamriel. When he arrived, the fortress was not the gleaming bastion of the old stories. Its outer walls stood weathered and scarred, moss creeping through cracks left by centuries of wind and neglect. Yet even in ruin, Sancre Tor seemed to breathe with quiet power, as if the stones themselves remembered the hands that had built them and the blood that had been spilled to defend them. The general came here not for conquest, but for purpose. His recent alliance between rival lords had stirred whispers across the land. Whispers of unity, whispers of empire. He knew that if such talk was to grow into something real, it needed more than mere agreements between rulers. It needed a foundation deeper than politics, a promise that could endure beyond the life of any single man. The keep's hall was cold and dim, lit only by narrow shafts of sunlight filtering through broken shutters. In the center stood a relic, the old oath stone of the Reman legions, polished smooth by the touch of countless hands. He approached it in silence, the echo of his boots on stone the only sound in the vast chamber. Placing his palm upon the surface, he spoke, not to the soldiers who once stood here, not even to the gods, but to Tamriel itself. His voice carried softly at first, then grew, filling the hall. He swore to unite the fractured realms, not for personal glory, but to bring stability to a land plagued by endless conflict. He vowed that no province would be held in chains without cause, and that those who joined his cause would do so not out of fear, but because they saw in his rule a future worth fighting for. It was said later that a strange stillness fell over the keep as he finished his oath. A cold wind passed through the hall, though no doors stood open, and the banners of the old empire stirred faintly, as if in acknowledgement. Whether it was the breath of the divines, or simply the weight of the moment upon the heart, none could say. But the general left Sancre Tor with a certainty that his path was now set. Word of his visit spread quickly. The symbolism was not lost on the people. To swear an oath at Sancre Tor was to step into the shadow of Reman himself, to claim a role not merely as a warlord, but as a potential restorer of the empire. Some saw this as a dangerous ambition, the first step toward tyranny. Others, weary of chaos, saw in it a spark of hope. The general did nothing to quash either interpretation. Let his enemies think him overreaching. Fear could be as useful a tool as respect. But among his allies, he began to speak more openly of a vision that stretched from the icy shores of Skyrim to the sunlit sands of elsewhere. Not a patchwork of shifting alliances, but a single realm bound together by law, trade, and shared destiny. Sancre Tor had given him more than symbolic legitimacy. It had given him a rallying cry. From this moment on, those who followed him were no longer bound merely by loyalty to a man, but to the dream he carried. Each soldier who marched under his banner, each envoy who negotiated in his name, carried a piece of that oath forward. The young general left the fortress at dawn, the rising sun painting the worn stones in gold. Behind him lay the ruins of the past. Ahead, the uncharted road to empire. He knew the journey would demand more than strength of arms. It would demand cunning, endurance, and a willingness to bear the weight of an entire continent's fate. And somewhere deep within, he knew that the oath he had sworn in the cold halls of Sancre Tor would not allow him to turn back, no matter the cost. The chill winds from Skyrim carried more than snow into Cyrodiil's northern passes. They carried rumors, whispered in mead halls and along caravan trails, that the young general who had sworn his oath at Sancre Tor now looked toward the rugged holds beyond the Jarl Mountains. To the Nords, these were not idle stories. They had seen the South's ambition before, and it had often come with armies. The general's advisors were divided. Some argued that the northern warlords were too stubborn, too proud, and that attempting to win their allegiance would drain resources better spent elsewhere. Others saw opportunity in their strength. If the Nords could be brought into the fold, willingly or otherwise, the foundation of a true empire would be laid in stone. He chose to go himself. This was not a campaign to be fought solely with soldiers. It was a test of his own presence, his ability to stand before men who valued strength above all else and convince them that he was not merely another southern pretender. The journey over the Jarl Range was long and treacherous. Snowdrifts swallowed the road, and icy winds clawed at exposed skin. Yet each night, as his party made camp, the general found his resolve hardening. They reached Falkreath hold first, a borderland where Nord and Imperial culture mingled uneasily. Here, he met Jornder the Wolf, a chieftain whose warriors were as fierce as their leader was cautious. Jornder welcomed him with the politeness due a guest, but there was no mistaking the guarded look in his eyes. The two men spoke over a long table of roasted venison and steaming ale, their words measured. The general spoke not of conquest, but of mutual strength. He painted a vision of a united north and south, their armies side by side, their borders secure, their enemies, both human and Daedric, held at bay. He did not flatter, Nord's distrusted honeyed words. Instead, he spoke plainly of the dangers that lay ahead if Skyrim and Cyrodiil remained divided. Jorindr listened, but the answer was not yet given. "You speak well, Imperial," he said at last, "but words are wind. Show me that your strength is not just in speech, and perhaps we will speak again." The challenge came sooner than expected. Raiders from the Reach had crossed into Falkreath territory, burning villages and seizing livestock. Rather than stand aside, the general rode with Jorindr's warriors into the snowy foothills. The battle was swift and brutal, steel ringing against steel, the snow stained red in the morning light. In the chaos, the general fought not from the rear, but at the very front, cutting through the enemy line with a calculated ferocity that earned the grudging respect of the Nord fighters. By the day's end, the raiders were driven back into the mountains, their spoils abandoned in the snow. Around the campfires that night, the Nord spoke differently of the Southerner. He was not just a man of words. He had fought shoulder to shoulder with them, risked his life where he might have sent others. That mattered. In the Nord way of thinking, trust was forged in battle. When they returned to Falkreath, Jorindr gave his answer. "You have shown that your cause is not carried only in parchment and speech," he said. "I will send my warriors when you call. But know this, the North bows to no man. We stand beside you, not beneath you." The general accepted with a nod. Alliances built on mutual respect were more durable than those built on fear. With Falkreath pledged, the word began to spread to other holds. The winds from the north now carried something new. Not just rumors, but the first stirrings of support for a man who might one day rule all Tamriel. Yet he knew this was only the beginning. Other warlords would not be so easily convinced, and each new ally brought with them new complexities. The dream of unity was taking shape, but so too were the shadows that would threaten it. The snows of Falkreath had barely melted when the alliance was tested. News came from Whiterun Hold that a feud older than living memory had flared again. Jorindr's warriors had clashed with the sons of a rival clan during a hunt near the Pale Pass. A few insults, some spilled mead, and old grudges were enough to spill blood. Now, Whiterun's Jarl accused Jorindr of breaking sacred guest right, and the fragile thread holding the alliance together began to fray. The general, still a stranger to many of Skyrim's power brokers, understood the danger. One northern feud could undo months of work. If this alliance fell apart before it truly formed, the other holds would see him as just another southerner meddling in their affairs. And so, he rode north again, this time to Whiterun, where the plains rolled wide beneath a sky sharp with winter stars. The Jarl of Whiterun, Hakon the Younger, was not like Jorindr. Where the Wolf of Falkreath was blunt and direct, Hakon was a man who measured his words carefully, the way one might measure the draw of a bow before letting the arrow fly. His mead hall was quiet when the general entered, the firelight casting long shadows against carved oak pillars. "I know why you've come," Hakon said, before pleasantries could be exchanged. "And I will tell you this. The blood of my kin stains Falkreath as snow. You speak of unity, but how can there be unity when a wolf's teeth are still wet?" The general did not deny the killings. Instead, he spoke of what he had seen in the Gerald passes, the raids, the endless cycle of retribution, the wasted lives. He reminded Hakon that Skyrim's strength had always come from standing together against the greater threat, be it from elves across the seas or Daedra beyond the Veil. "The enemy waits for us to tear at one another," he said, "and when we are weak, they will come." Hakon listened, but his eyes remained wary. "Fine words," he said, "but if the wolf has bitten, how will you keep it from biting again?" The general proposed a trial not of law, but of honor, a contest in the old Nord way, where champions from both sides would meet in single combat. Not to the death, but until one yielded. In this way, the blood debt could be paid without igniting a war between holds. Hakon agreed, though his voice carried the edge of a challenge. The duel was held on a wide, frozen field outside Whiterun. Jorindr's champion, a bear of a man named Skari, faced Hakon's nephew, swift and wiry as a hunting cat. The general stood between them before the match, speaking the words of peace that would follow its conclusion, no matter the victor. Then the clash began, steel ringing through the cold air, boots crunching against ice. Blades flashed, shields splintered, and the crowd roared. Skari fought with raw power, driving his opponent back with every swing. Yet the nephew was quick, turning aside, killing blows with a dancer's grace. At last, Skari's shield arm faltered, and he dropped to one knee. The duel was over. Hakon's kin had won, but in victory, he extended a hand to his fallen foe. The gesture was not lost on the watching clans. In that frozen moment, something shifted. The feud had been answered without further death, and the old ways had been honored. Later that night, under the smoke-black beams of Whiterun's hall, Jorindr and Hakon drank from the same horn, sealing their truce before the gathered thanes. The general said little, letting the Nords speak for themselves. But as he watched the two Jarls share the firelight, he knew the lesson. Unity among the Nords could not be commanded. It had to be earned, tested, and proven in the ways they respected. When he left Whiterun, the winds from the north carried more than respect. They carried his name, not as a foreigner seeking to rule, but as a dragon who understood the wolf's heart. Yet far beyond the mountains, others were beginning to take notice. The threads of alliance he wove in Skyrim were being watched by eyes in distant lands, some curious, others wary, and some quietly planning to cut them. The thaw of early spring had barely touched Skyrim when the general turned his gaze westward. His alliance among the Nords, though far from complete, was now sturdy enough to withstand the small storms of clan politics. The next thread in his growing tapestry lay across the jagged spine of the Druidak Mountains. Hammerfell, land of red sands, fierce tempers, and sharper blades. Hammerfell was no stranger to conflict. The Red Guards were heirs to a warrior tradition older than most empires, forged on the burning shores of Yakuta before that land sank beneath the waves. They prized freedom above all else, and their history with outsiders was one of wary truces at best, open war at worst. Yet their holds were not united. Rival crowns and city-states often clashed over borders, trade routes, and honor. For the general, this was both an opportunity and a danger. If he could gain the trust of even one of Hammerfell's great powers, the rest might be drawn to his cause, or at least persuaded not to stand in his way. But to misstep here could mean becoming another name in their long litany of southern interlopers buried in the sand. He entered Hammerfell through the eastern passes, where the wind still carried the bite of Skyrim's winter, but the earth beneath was already warming to the desert's breath. His first destination was Sentinel, jewel of the Iliac Bay, whose harbors welcomed ships from every corner of Tamriel. There, the High King of Hammerfell ruled, or so the title claimed. In truth, his influence was strongest along the coasts, while the inland regions answered more to their own sword masters and warlords. The High King, Thassid II, received the general in a hall of sunlit marble and gold. Unlike the mead halls of Skyrim, here the air was thick with the scent of spice and the faint salt of the sea. Thassid was no fool. He had already heard rumors of the Dragon of the North, a war leader whose words carried as much weight as his sword. "You seek allies," Thassid said after the formal greetings. "But Hammerfell is not Skyrim. Here, we bow to no outsider's crown." The general nodded. "Nor do I ask it. I seek a bond between warriors, a shield wall against the storms that gather beyond Tamriel's shores." Thassid's eyes narrowed, studying the man before him. "Fine words," he said, echoing Hakon of Whiterun. "But Hammerfell has weathered many storms alone." Before the general could reply, the court doors burst open. A messenger stumbled in, dust on his cloak, panic in his voice. Raiders from the Alakar Desert had struck the northern trade road, seizing caravans bound for Sentinel. Among the captured was a cousin of the High King. The court erupted into shouts and demands for retribution. Thassid called for his captains, but the general stepped forward. "Let me ride," he said. "If I return with your kin unharmed, you will know my words are more than wind." Thassid hesitated, then gave his assent. And so, before the sun had set, the general was galloping into the desert with a small band of Red Guard outriders, their curved scimitars gleaming in the fading light. The desert nights were cold, the dunes silver beneath the moons, and the wind sang like an old spirit through the rocks. They found the raiders' camp at dawn, a scattering of tents among jagged spires of stone. The fight was swift and brutal, steel clashing against steel, arrows hissing through the air. The general fought at the front, his voice carrying commands that the Red Guards followed without question. By the time the sun rose high, the raiders lay scattered, and the High King's cousin was free. When they returned to Sentinel, the general was greeted not as an outsider, but as a brother in arms. Thassid himself clasped his forearm in the warrior's grip. "You have the heart of a Red Guard," the king said. "And for now, Hammerfell's heart beats with yours." It was a small victory, but victories are often seeds. In the shaded courtyards of Sentinel, whispers began to spread of the dragon, whose shadow stretched across borders. Yet in the deep south of Hammerfell, there were others who saw that shadow not as a shield, but as the outline of an empire reborn, and they began to sharpen their blades. The alliance with Thassid II was still fresh when the desert winds began to shift. Word traveled quickly in Hammerfell, carried not only by couriers, but by wandering sword singers, traders, and smugglers whose tongues were sharper than their blades. In the southern city of Rahad and the inland fortress of Tanith, the general's name was spoken with both admiration and unease. Some saw him as a foreign champion who had earned the High King's favor through courage and honor. Others whispered that he was the first shadow of a new Surdailic conqueror, come to bind Hammerfell's free cities beneath a single banner. To the proud and fiercely independent Red Guards, the scent of an empire, even one draped in the language of alliance, was enough to stir blood. The tension became impossible to ignore when a delegation from Tanith arrived in Sentinel's harbor. They were not emissaries of peace. Clad in lacquered armor, their leader, Lord Amyel A.F. Tanith, brought a formal complaint to Thassid's court. "You send your warriors north with an outlander," Amyel declared before the assembled captains. "You place him at the head of Red Guard riders, as if Hammerfell needs the sword arm of Skyrim to defend its own." Thassid's jaw tightened, but before he could answer, the general stepped forward. His voice was calm, though his eyes stayed fixed on Amyel. "When raiders strike, I ride. Not for crown, not for conquest, only for those who cannot stand alone. If my steel offends you, I will sheath it. But know this, steel kept idle is rust in the making." The court murmured at the exchange, some nodding in approval, others frowning. Amyel was unmoved. "Then let us see if your steel is worth the stories," he said. "Rahad suffers now under the blades of corsairs from the Abyssian Sea. If you are so eager to spill your blood for Hammerfell, ride south and prove it." It was a challenge, and the general accepted without hesitation. Within the week, he and a mixed company of Sentinel and Tanith warriors set sail down the coast. The Abyssian glittered under the midday sun, but its beauty was deceptive. Pirates lurked behind its waves like wolves behind tall grass. They found the corsairs anchored in a hidden cove, their black sails furled as they counted their plunder. The assault came swift. Arrows rained from the cliffs while Red Guard ships closed in from the sea. The general led the boarding action, his voice cutting through the clash of steel. Pirates fell into the waves, their cries swallowed by the surf. By dusk, the cove was silent save for the cries of gulls. The Red Guards had reclaimed their stolen goods and freed the captives taken from Rahad's docks. Among the Tanith warriors, respect began to grow, not just for the general's sword, but for his willingness to fight shoulder to shoulder without demanding fealty in return. When they returned to Sentinel, Amyel himself greeted the general. His words were few, but they carried weight. "You fight well, perhaps too well. Men will follow you if you keep this path, and that will make you both friend and rival in Hammerfell." The general understood. The Red Guards were bound by honor, but honor could be as sharp as it was noble. The more he earned their trust, the more he risked drawing their suspicion. Hammerfell's warriors respected strength, yet feared any hand that might close into a fist over their freedom. In the quiet nights that followed, he would walk the sea walls of Sentinel, listening to the wind off the Iliac Bay. The desert was not his home, yet it had already tested him more than many battlefields. Here, alliances were like the shifting sands, shaped by wind, never still for long. And in the shifting shadows, a greater truth began to take form. If Hammerfell could not be united within itself, no outside cause, be it noble or imperial, could truly bind it. The general knew his time here was drawing to a close. His path would soon lead east again toward the heartlands of Cyrodiil, where a different kind of battle awaited. But he also knew that in the years to come, the memory of his deeds would linger in Hammerfell, a name spoken in both blessing and warning. The winds of Hammerfell had carried him far, but the pull of destiny drew him back toward the green and gold heartlands of Cyrodiil. The Iliac Bay fell behind as his ship cut across the topple waters, its sails swollen with promise and uncertainty. He had come west as a Sel's word, fought in deserts and coves, and walked among warriors who valued freedom above life itself. Yet now, the call was for something greater, a cause not of one province, but of the whole of Tamriel. The ruby throne sat in the imperial city, a seat of both majesty and danger. The dragon emperors of the Septim line had once been unchallenged rulers, but the years had seen that power fray. The current emperor was no warrior king of legend, but an aging ruler surrounded by whispering advisors and rival claimants who sharpened daggers in the dark. When the general first laid eyes on the white gold tower again, it was at sunrise. The great spire caught the morning light like a blade's edge, its golden stone glinting as if forged anew. Yet beneath the gleam lay a city restless with ambition. Merchants haggled in the market district. Nobles eyed each other with the false warmth of courtly smiles. The air was thick with the scent of politics, sweeter and deadlier than any battlefield. His return was not quiet. Those who had fought alongside him in the War of the Bend Armagh greeted him as a proven commander. But to others, especially the imperial nobility, he was an outsider, a man whose loyalty was untested and whose ambitions were unknown. Some saw a sword to be wielded, others a rival to be watched. The emperor himself received him in the great audience hall, where sunlight poured through tall windows, illuminating the red and gold banners of the empire. The throne loomed at the far end, a seat carved for a god chosen, but now held by mortal hands. Tamriel has been restless in my reign, the emperor said, his voice carrying both weariness and steel. We need unity. We need strength. They say you have both. The general bowed. Strength is not enough, Majesty. A blade alone cannot hold a realm together. It must be wielded by a steady hand. The emperor's eyes narrowed slightly, as though weighing the man before him. Then he smiled, a faint, knowing smile that spoke of unspoken plans. We shall see if your hand is steady. It began slowly, not with grand declarations, but with small tasks, commanding border legions against bandits, settling disputes between quarreling counts, escorting imperial envoys through hostile provinces. Each mission tested not only his skill in battle, but his ability to navigate the empire's tangled web of allegiances. The general found that war in the heartlands was rarely fought with steel alone. A banquet could be as perilous as a siege. A whispered rumor could destroy a campaign before it began. He learned to listen more than he spoke, to weigh every alliance, and to offer favors with the precision of a sword stroke. Yet beyond the court's games, he saw the fractures widening across the empire. Skyrim's jarls muttered about independence. The Colovian West and Nibene Valley eyed each other with growing mistrust. In the south, the swamps of Black Marsh seethed with unrest. And always, on the far horizon, lay the threat of Almarai ambition. The emperor confided in him more with each passing season, sharing both hopes and fears. If we do not stand united, he warned, we will be carved apart, province by province, until the empire is nothing but a memory told in taverns. It was in those moments that the general began to see the path before him. not simply as a soldier or commander, but as something far greater. To unite Tamriel would require more than swords. It would demand vision, will, and a willingness to bear the weight of the dragon crown itself. The seeds had been planted. The ruby throne was not yet his, but already the shadow of the dragon banner seemed to stretch behind him. The white gold tower gleamed in the daylight, but its shadow was long, and it reached into places where light could never follow. In those corridors, where the banners of the dragon hung still and heavy, whispered bargains were made, and silent blades were drawn in the dark. The general soon learned that Cyrodiil's heart was not kept beating by armies or legions, but by the quiet machinery of influence, by those who could bend the will of counts, sway guild masters, and send rivals to early graves without ever being seen. It was a war without battlefields, fought in drawing rooms and camelot chambers. It began with the rumors. Some said the emperor trusted him too much. Others whispered that he sought the ruby throne for himself. Even a hint of such ambition was dangerous, for the court was a place where suggestion alone could be turned into a weapon. Invitations to banquets became tests. Casual conversations were veiled interrogations. He learned to walk through the palace as if each stone beneath his feet could vanish without warning. One night, as the moon cast silver light across the city, a messenger arrived in his quarters. No seal marked the letter, only a strip of red silk tied around the parchment. The message inside was simple. Meet at the third arch of the Talos Plaza Aqueduct. Midnight. Alone. He went, of course. In this city, refusing such an invitation was as dangerous as accepting it. Beneath the arch stood a cloaked figure whose voice was soft yet urgent. They spoke of a conspiracy within the Elder Council, of powerful lords who believed the emperor too frail to rule and who intended to force a transition of power. You have the emperor's ear, the figure said. That makes you dangerous to them, more dangerous than you realize. Over the weeks that followed, the truth emerged in pieces. Assassins moved through the city, disguised as merchants and pilgrims. Bribes passed hands beneath temple altars. 2 minor nobles vanished from their estates, their holdings quietly seized by allies of the plotters. The general began to see the threads, thin, almost invisible, but forming a net that could snare the whole of the empire. It was here that his Hammerfell years served him well. In that land, you learned to survive both blade and betrayal. He began his own countermeasures, meeting with loyal captains in the shadows, posting guards at key corridors, and planting false rumors to smoke out those who spread them. Every move he made was mirrored by one from the other side, as if the entire city were caught in a deadly game of Cyrodiilic chess. One night, the game turned bloody. An assassin struck within the palace itself, cutting down a seneschal who had been one of the emperor's closest advisors. The killer escaped, but their weapon, a curved dagger of Akaviri steel, was found lodged in the wooden frame of the seneschal's desk. Whether it was meant as a signature or a diversion was unclear, but the message was unmistakable. No one was beyond reach. The emperor, though shaken, seemed to grow sharper in his resolve. "These are the wolves at our door," he told the general. "And you, perhaps you are the hound that will drive them off." Trust, once given, became a weapon of its own. The general was granted greater command over the Imperial Guard, authority to reorganize certain legions, and a freer hand in dealing with threats both foreign and domestic. Yet he knew such power was a double-edged sword. Every step upward placed him further in the sight lines of those who feared his rise. In the months that followed, whispers turned to open maneuvering. Names were spoken more freely. Counts, guild leaders, even members of the Elder Council themselves. Some he could sway to the emperor's cause. Others could only be neutralized. And some, he knew, would have to be removed entirely before their knives found the right moment. By year's end, the plot had been blunted, though not destroyed. The emperor still sat the ruby throne, and the general's influence had grown far beyond what it had been when he first arrived. But in the silence that followed, he understood a truth that would guide him for years to come. The empire could be defended with legions, yes, but to truly rule it, one must master the shadows as well. And in those shadows, the dragon was beginning to stir. The wind in Skyrim was unlike any the general had known before. It cut through armor and cloak alike, carrying with it the scent of pine and frost and the distant tang of wood smoke from villages clinging to the sides of frozen valleys. It was a land that did not yield easily, not to the seasons, not to its own people, and certainly not to the will of a foreign empire. When the Emperor's summons came, it was clear what was expected. The Jarls of Skyrim were fractious, their loyalty to the Empire more a matter of convenience than conviction. Border raids from the Reach, skirmishes between holds, and whispers of rebellion threatened to pull the province into chaos. The Emperor needed a hand both steady and unyielding, one that could command steel on the battlefield and earn grudging respect in the mead halls. The general arrived in solitude in the dead of winter. The sea of ghosts roared below the cliffs, and the banners of the wolf and the dragon fluttered together in the icy wind. High Queen Azura met him with the formal courtesy of one who accepts aid but does not yet trust the giver. Around them, the court watched with wary eyes, measuring this outsider who claimed to serve their emperor, yet walked like a man used to ruling himself. The first campaign was swift and brutal. Bandit lords who had carved out petty kingdoms in the Pale were hunted down, their strongholds burned, their men given the choice of imperial service or exile beyond the border. The general led from the front, as he had in Hammerfell, cutting through the snow with his men, sharing their rations, sleeping under the same frost-stiffened tents. In the eyes of the Nords, this was not weakness, but proof of worth. But Skyrim was not won by steel alone. After the fighting, he remained in the villages, breaking bread with their elders, listening to their grievances, and, when possible, addressing them directly. A collapsed bridge repaired by Imperial engineers spoke louder than any decree from Cyrodiil. Grain brought to a starving hold in the depths of winter did more to cement loyalty than a dozen garrison troops. Still, not all could be swayed. In the Reach, a warlord named Ulfr Ironbear rallied clans to his banner, calling for the expulsion of every Imperial from the province. He claimed the divines themselves had shown him a vision of Skyrim washed clean of southern influence. To face him meant venturing into the high passes, where avalanches could bury an army in moments, and the cold could kill faster than any sword. The general chose his path carefully. He split his forces into smaller, faster-moving warbands, each striking at Ulfr's supply lines and outposts. Weeks of relentless pressure wore the warlord's host thin. When the final battle came in the shadow of the Druidak Mountains, it was over in a matter of hours. Ulfr fell, not to a spear in his back, but in single combat, his blood steaming on the snow as the general's blade found its mark. Word that duel spread quickly. Among the Nords, the story was told with a mixture of awe and grudging admiration. Some claimed the general fought with the fury of Shor himself. Others said Talos had already marked him as his own. Whatever the truth, the victory marked a turning point. By the end of his second winter in Skyrim, the holds stood quieter. The Jarls still bickered, such was their way, but their disputes no longer threatened open war. The High Queen spoke of him not as an outsider, but as our steel-clad brother. Even in the mead halls of Windhelm and Whiterun, where imperial sympathies were rare, his name was spoken with respect. Yet the general knew this peace was a fragile one. Skyrim's loyalty was like the ice on the rivers, solid in winter, but ready to crack and flow with the spring thaw. To hold it would require more than victories on the battlefield. It would demand a vision, a reason for the Nords to see the Empire not as a chain, but as a shield. In the flicker of the hearth's firelight, as snow beat against the shutters of the longhouse, he began to shape that vision. It was a dream of a unified Tamriel, strong enough to withstand any threat, be it from the Dominion, from the Daedra, or from the chaos within. A dream that would require not only the steel of the North, but the will to bind all provinces under one banner. And so, in the cold heart of Skyrim, the general's ambition began to take its truest form. The snows had begun to soften in the low valleys. and the smell of thawed earth mingled with the sharp bite of pine resin in the air. In Solitude's great hall, the High Queen convened her court, and for the first time, the general was not simply a guest from the Empire, but an honored speaker at her side. His campaigns had brought relative peace to the province, but peace in Skyrim was a restive creature, always sniffing the air for the scent of battle. The High Queen understood this, as did the general. They both knew that the fragile unity among the holds could shatter at the first slight. So, between hunts and war councils, there were feasts, long nights where the mead ran freely, and the sagas of both Nord and Imperial heroes were sung side by side. In these gatherings, the general was careful to honor Skyrim's traditions, raising toasts to Iskramor and the 500 companions, even as he spoke of the divines and the Emperor's vision for Tamriel. Some Jarls responded warmly, their pride swayed by his victories and their loyalty coaxed by his respect for their customs. Others remained distant, their eyes sharp as wolves, weighing his every word for weakness or deceit. To the general, this was another kind of battlefield, one where the weapons were wit, patience, and the art of binding wounds invisible to the flesh. Yet even as diplomacy blossomed, the North's old rivalries flared. In the east, the Jarl of Windhelm accused the Jarl of Whiterun of encroaching on ancient hunting grounds. The High Queen sent the general to mediate, and he traveled between the two great halls, braving storms that turned the roads to sheets of ice. He listened to both sides, not with the cold authority of an outsider, but with the measured patience of one who had lived through the folly of pride. The resolution he offered was neither command nor plea. It was challenge. He proposed that the two Jarls settle the matter through a contest of champions, each selecting warriors to face one another in honorable combat. The terms were clear. The victor's claim would stand for a generation, and the loser would forswear all vengeance. The duel was fierce, the clang of axes ringing out across the frozen plain. When Whiterun's champion finally felled his foe, the Jarl of Windhelm nodded in grim acceptance. There were no riots, no retaliations, only a hard-earned respect for the one who had kept the quarrel from becoming a war. It was in moments like this that the general's reputation grew beyond that of a mere sword arm for the Empire. In Skyrim, he was becoming something rarer, a unifier. But every unifier in history had been forced to confront the truth that unity cannot be bought without the currency of trust, and trust was the slowest fortune to build. In the spring, the High Queen invited him to accompany her to the Moot, the rare council where the Jarls of all Skyrim met to debate matters of the realm. There, seated beneath the towering antlers of the hall's great throne, the general witnessed the raw and roaring heart of Nord politics. Voices clashed like shields, alliances shifted mid-sentence, and grudges older than the white gold tower were aired with shameless vigor. When the queen finally called for order, she invited the general to speak. His words were simple. He told the story of a battlefield in Hammerfell where Redguard and Nord had stood together against a wave of Orcish raiders. He spoke of how the victory had been won not by the sharpness of their swords, but by the bond between warriors who would not yield to one another's fall. It was not a command. It was not even a plea. But in the hall's smoky stillness, some of the hardest faces softened, if only for a moment. The moot ended without bloodshed, which in Skyrim was counted as a triumph. By the time he returned to Solitude, the general had begun to feel the weight of his role. He was not only binding Skyrim to the Empire, he was weaving himself into the tapestry of its history. Already, songs were sung in the longhouses of a man who walked like an Imperial but fought with the heart of a Nord. Children played at being him in the snow, lifting wooden swords and shouting his name as if it belonged to their own lineage. But in quiet moments, when the fire's glow sank low and the wind howled against the shutters, the general thought beyond Skyrim. If the North could be brought to heel, not through conquest, but through respect, what might be possible in the other provinces? Could Cyrodiil's banner fly unchallenged over the Somerset Isles, Black Marsh, or even distant Morrowind? The answer would not be found in a single battle. It would come in the long, patient forging of alliances the quiet binding of oaths, and the steady march of a vision too vast for one lifetime. Yet for the man who would one day be called Tiber Septim, the path was beginning to clear. The thaw in Skyrim's valleys brought with it not only the smell of fresh earth and pine, but also the slow awakening of old dangers. Wolves descended from the high passes in lean packs, their howls carrying over the meadows. Bandits, ever the carrion birds of troubled times, emerged from the caves and abandoned watchtowers to prey on unguarded roads. Yet these were but surface threats. Beneath them lay a deeper tension, coiling through the province like a serpent under snow. Whispers reached the general of the faction in the east, Nord loyalists who saw the growing unity under the High Queen not as a triumph, but as a sign of weakness. They were led by a Jarl whose name was spoken with both reverence and fear, Hrothgar Wolfmane. He was no petty brigand. He had once served as a shield brother to the Queen's father and had fought in campaigns that bloodied both Nord and Orc alike. But age and pride had turned his loyalty inward, to Skyrim alone, unbowed to any empire. It was at the Queen's request that the general rode to Windhelm to meet this wolf-faced lord. The journey was long, the road narrowing into frozen corridors of ice and stone. The people they passed watched in silence, some nodding in respect, others turning away as if to deny his presence. Hrothgar received him in a hall dimly lit by a single fire pit, its smoke curling into the rafters like the breath of some ancient beast. The old Jarl's eyes were clear and sharp as polished steel. "You are the Emperor's sword," Hrothgar said, his voice deep and unhurried. "But a sword can be turned. Tell me, are you here to cut us down or to cut us free?" The general answered with care, "I am here so that Skyrim's strength need never be spent on fighting itself. I am here so the wolf and the dragon might stand side by side." Hrothgar laughed, a sound like ice breaking. "The wolf has no master, and the dragon seeks to rule the skies. How do you bind such creatures?" "By giving them something greater to hunt," the general replied. The conversation did not end in agreement, but neither did it end in enmity. The Jarl allowed him to remain in Windhelm as a guest, though it was plain the invitation was as much a test as an honor. For days, the general walked the city's narrow streets, speaking with warriors, traders, and fishers. He listened more than he spoke, learning their grievances, their pride, and the stories they told around their hearths. Then came the threat that would force wolf and dragon to fight as one. Scouts reported that a war band of orcs, hardened from years of exile, had crossed into Skyrim from the west, pillaging villages in their path. Their numbers were greater than either Windhelm or Solitude could muster alone. When news reached Hrothgar, he called for the general. "You spoke of a greater hunt," the Jarl said. "The prey is before us. Let us see if your dragon fights with honor." The campaign was swift and brutal. The orc warband fought with a ferocity born of desperation, their armor patched and scarred from a dozen battles. The general and Hrothgar led from the front, the wolf's axe and the dragon's sword cutting through the snow-streaked chaos. At one point, the general found himself surrounded, his shield splintered under a hammer's blow. Before the killing stroke could fall, Hrothgar's axe struck from the side, cleaving the orc's helm. After the final battle, they stood together on a hill overlooking the smoldering remains of the Warband's camp. The sky above was streaked with red and gold, as if painted by some unseen hand. "You fight well," Hrothgar said at last. "Perhaps the dragon and the wolf are not so different after all." The general inclined his head. "Perhaps the sky is wide enough for both to roam." When they returned to Windhelm, the Jarl hosted a feast in his honor. Before the assembled warriors, Hrothgar lifted the general's arm and declared him a friend of Windhelm. It was not fealty, but it was the first step toward it. The High Queen received the news with a satisfaction she did not conceal. The wolf had not been tamed, but it no longer bared its fangs of the dragon. And in the long game of uniting Skyrim, that was a victory worth more than a dozen battles. Yet, in the quiet that followed, the general knew the lesson was deeper. Power in Skyrim was not taken. It was shared, earned through sweat and steel until it became something greater than obedience. It became respect, and respect, once given, could bind a land far more tightly than chains. Winter struck early that year, not with the gradual frost that eased its way into the valleys, but with a sudden and merciless blizzard that buried roads, shattered supply lines, and locked whole villages in walls of white. Even the longhouses of Windhelm groaned under the weight of snow that refused to melt. For a time, the war drums were silent, not out of peace, but because even the most hardened warriors could not march through drifts taller than a man. The general remained in Windhelm, bound not by chains but by circumstance. The High Queen had sent word. He was to assist Hrothgar in keeping the eastern holds from starving. The message was formal, but between the lines it carried a test. Could the fragile trust between wolf and dragon survive when there were no orcs to fight, no clear enemy to unite them? The work began with the hearth fires. Timber was scarce. Much had already been burned or buried under snow. The general ordered hunting parties to range farther into the forests, not only for game, but for fallen trees that could be hauled back on sleds. Hrothgar's men grumbled at first. Taking orders from an Imperial-born commander was no easy thing for Windhelm's proud warriors. But the general shared their burdens, hauling wood on his own shoulders, his breath clouding in the icy air beside theirs. One night, after returning from a week-long hunt, he found Hrothgar waiting in the great hall, a map spread on the long table. The Jarl's expression was grim. "There is a village north of here," Hrothgar said, "snowbound since the first blizzard. No word from them in weeks. If they've run out of stores, they will not survive the month." The general studied the map. The route was treacherous. Narrow passes where snow could collapse without warning. Rivers frozen, but not solid enough to bear weight. Still, the alternative was to let the villagers die. That was no choice at all. They set out at dawn, a company of 20 warriors, half Windhelm men, half soldiers loyal to the general. The storm had abated, but the cold was a living thing, gnawing at fingers and faces even through fur-lined gauntlets. For 2 days they cut their way through drifts, ice cracking beneath their boots, until at last the roofs of the village came into view, buried almost to the thatch. The people they found there were gaunt and hollow-eyed. The elders had given the last of their food to the children. Fires had burned low, and some had resorted to breaking apart their own homes for fuel. The supplies the rescuers carried were enough to keep them alive, but not enough to see them through the rest of winter. Hrothgar stood in the snow, his breath a pale cloud. If we bring them back to Windhelm, they will not all survive the journey. But if they stay, he didn't finish the sentence. The general looked at the villagers, then at the warriors who stood behind them. "Then we will stay here until they can travel," he said. "All of us." And so they did. For weeks, the warriors dug shelters, hunted what game could be found, and taught the villagers how to set traps in the snow. Imperial and Nord, once strangers, shared fires and bread. Bonds were forged not in battle, but in the slow, grinding work of keeping one another alive. One night, during a rare lull in the wind, Hrothgar approached the general outside the main shelter. He carried 2 knives, each with a carved bone handle. "In my clan," Hrothgar said, "when men save each other's lives, they make a blood oath. It binds them beyond banners or crowns." The general took the offer blade. "Then let us be bound, wolf and dragon." They cut their palms and clasped hands, their mingled blood steaming in the cold. It was not fealty, nor was it submission. It was an oath between equals, sworn under the gaze of the moons. When spring came and the passes cleared, the villagers were brought to Windhelm. The tale of the blood oath spread quickly, not just in the east, but across Skyrim. The image of the wolf and dragon standing together in the snow became a symbol, one that the High Queen understood was more valuable than any treaty. For the general, the lesson was carved deep. Power was not only taken on the battlefield. Sometimes it was earned in the silence between storms, when men stood shoulder to shoulder against the cold. And that kind of loyalty could outlast empires. Spring in Skyrim was not the soft, gentle renewal of the South. Here, it came like a hesitant guest, melting the snow in jagged patches, letting streams run free for a time before freezing again at night. Yet to those who had endured the blizzards, the scent of thawing earth was sweeter than any feast. The people of Windhelm celebrated the survival of the northern village as though it were a victory in war. But beyond the walls, word of the blood oath between wolf and dragon had begun to spread, carried by merchants, travelers, and even bards who stitched the story into song. In Cyrodiil, such tales traveled fast, and they reached the ears of Emperor Cullikane's advisors before the snow had fully melted. The Emperor's court was a place where silence could be more dangerous than open hostility. Some lords saw the general's growing influence in Skyrim as a blessing, proof that imperial presence could earn loyalty even from the fiercely independent Nords. Others saw it as a warning. A man who could win the trust of both imperial soldiers and Nordic jarls might one day wield more authority than the emperor intended. A messenger arrived in Windhelm bearing a sealed letter. The general broke the wax and read the neat, clipped script. Return to the imperial city. His Majesty requests your counsel on matters of the northern frontier. The wording was polite, but the weight beneath it was unmistakable. This was not a request. It was a summons. Before leaving, the general met with Hrothgar in the Great Hall. The Nord Jarl regarded him in silence for a long moment before speaking. When you go south, remember this. The people here will follow the one who keeps their hearts warm and their bellies full, not the one who sits 1,000 miles away on a golden throne. The journey to the imperial city was a study in contrast. The further south they traveled, the more the air softened, the more the land bloomed with color. But the warmth did nothing to ease the tension building in the general's chest. He knew that the court's invitation was as much an evaluation as it was an honor. The imperial city rose from the Nibene Basin like a vision, its white gold tower catching the afternoon sun. The streets bustled with merchants and nobles, their robes bright with dyes that northern folk could only dream of affording. Yet for all its splendor, the city's heart was a place of shadows, whispered deals, hidden debts, and alliances that could shift overnight. In the audience chamber, Emperor Cullikane greeted the general with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "You've done well in the north," the emperor said. "Better than some thought possible." The general bowed. "I serve the Empire, as always." "Of course," Cullikane replied, stepping closer. "But loyalty is a curious thing. It can be earned, yes, but it can also be redirected." The meeting was brief, but it left the general with the uneasy sense that he had been weighed like a coin in the emperor's palm, judged for value, tested for flaws. In the days that followed, he attended feasts and council sessions, each one laced with undercurrents. Some advisors spoke to him in warm tones, praising his work in Skyrim. Others kept their distance, their eyes cold with calculation. One evening, a cloaked figure found him in the palace gardens. "The emperor is not your enemy," the stranger said, "but neither is he your friend. Remember that." The man vanished into the shadows before the general could speak. When the summons finally came for him to return north, it was delivered with the same careful politeness as before. No reprimand, no accusation, only the subtle reminder that the emperor's gaze was never far away. As the general rode out of the imperial city, the white gold tower faded behind him, but its shadow seemed to stretch all the way to Skyrim. He understood now that every step he took in the north would be watched, measured, and perhaps one day challenged. Still, as the cold air of the Jarl Mountains met his face, he felt something close to relief. Skyrim was harsh, but its dangers were honest. In the Emperor's shadow, the knives were hidden and far sharper. The ride north was long, and though the cold was a familiar companion, the general carried with him an unease that no mountain wind could freeze away. The court in Cyrodiil had its own kind of winter, one of polished words and hidden blades, and he could not shake the feeling that some of its frost was following him home. By the time he crossed the Pale Pass, messengers were already waiting. They brought reports not of battle, but of whispers, odd movements among the Jarls, strange shifts in allegiance, and merchants arriving with more coin than goods. It was the kind of quiet trouble that rarely came from within Skyrim. This had the scent of outside hands at work. Windhelm greeted him with its usual icy stoicism. But in the Great Hall, Hrothgar's expression was darker than the storm clouds gathering over the Sea of Ghosts. While you were gone, the Jarl said, "A gift arrived from Solitude, a cask of wine, said to be from the Emperor himself. We share it with our council. By morning, 2 of my stewards were dead." The general studied the Jarl's face. "Poison." Hrothgar nodded. "A slow one. Old, deliberate. It was a warning. Not from the Emperor, at least not directly, but from someone who wished the North to know that loyalty to the general was dangerous." Over the next weeks, the signs multiplied. Caravan routes shifted inexplicably. Trusted captains began receiving conflicting orders, supposedly bearing the imperial seal. Old rivalries between clans flared again, fed by anonymous letters and forged accusations. The North was being unraveled, not with armies, but with words and subtle knives. The general convened a council of his most trusted allies, both Nord and Imperial. They met in the longhouse by torchlight, their voices low. "This is no common banditry," said Captain Vero. "Someone is moving pieces on a board we cannot see." Hrothgar growled, "And they're betting that we'll tear ourselves apart before we notice the hand pushing the pieces." The general listened in silence before speaking. "The court in Cyrodiil is full of factions. Some wish to see the North loyal. Others wish to see it weak. I suspect one of them is acting without the Emperor's open command, but with his tolerance. The plan they shaped was not one of open retaliation. Instead, the general moved to tighten the bonds between his allies. He sent Nord warriors to guard Imperial supply lines and Imperial engineers to repair Nord fortresses. In the taverns and markets, he spread word of shared victories, not of sabotage. If the enemy wanted division, they would find unity instead. Still, in quiet moments, he considered the delicate balance he was trying to hold. Too much trust in the Empire, and the Nords would brand him a puppet. Too much loyalty to Skyrim, and the Emperor's court would begin sharpening their knives in earnest. One night, as he walked the walls of Windhelm, a snowstorm howling beyond the gates, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. It was the same cloaked figure from the palace gardens in Cyrodiil. "They've begun the game," the man said. "Your victories in the north have made you a threat to those who profit from weakness. You'll need more than swords to survive." "Who are you?" the general demanded. "A friend," came the reply, for now. The stranger placed a folded parchment in his hand and vanished as suddenly as he had appeared. In the light of the watchtower, the general unfolded the note. It contained a single name, a high-ranking imperial noble, and the words, "He moves against you." By morning, the stranger's warning seemed half a dream, but the tension in the air was all too real. The threads of treachery were tightening, and though no enemy banners yet flew on Skyrim's borders, the war for its future had already begun. The snow fell heavier now, thick flakes that blurred the horizon and muffled the sound of marching boots. In the stillness between gusts of wind, the general could almost believe that Skyrim slept in peace. But peace had become an illusion, a thin crust over a churning sea. News reached Windhelm in fragments. A Jarl in the west had declared himself independent of both the Empire and the High King. A fortified caravan bound for Solitude had been ambushed in a narrow pass, its guards slain and cargo taken without a trace. Worst of all, scouts reported strange banners flying near the Pale Pass, black wolves on crimson cloth. It was not a sigil known in Skyrim, but one that the general had seen in old Imperial dispatches, the personal mark of a warlord who had once served the Empire and now sought his own crown. The council gathered in the longhouse, the air thick with the heat of the fire and the weight of their words. "He's probing us," Captain Vero said, tracing a gloved finger along the map spread on the table. "Testing our borders, seeing where the lines are weakest." Hrothgar slammed his fist down. "Then we show him our weakest point is still stronger than his best." The general did not speak at once. He studied the map, the supply routes, the mountain passes that were both a shield and a snare. The enemy had chosen the Pale Pass for a reason. It was the old artery between Skyrim and Cyrodiil, a place where an army could strike swiftly before vanishing into the high snowfields. At dawn, he rode with a vanguard to the east. The cold bit hard, but the wind carried more than frost. It carried the scent of smoke. Cresting a ridge, he saw it. A village burned to its timbers, its mead hall collapsed, its people scattered or dead. No survivors spoke of the attack. The enemy had left none behind. Only the black wolf banners remained, planted like a dare in the frozen ground. The general's officers argued over whether to strike immediately or wait for reinforcements. But the decision was already forming in his mind. The enemy wanted to draw them into a direct battle on open ground, an easy place to measure strength against strength. Instead, he would turn the mountains themselves into a weapon. For 3 days, his forces moved unseen, using Old Nord trails that skirted the high cliffs. Scouts slipped into enemy camps at night, cutting lines, scattering supplies, and sowing confusion. The warlord's men began to march slower, their formation loosening as hunger and cold gnawed at them. On the 4th day, as the black wolf banners approached the pass in force, the trap was sprung. Boulders tumbled from the ridges above, breaking the ice on the river below and sending men plunging into freezing waters. Archers loosed from hidden perches, their arrows striking in the chaos. By the time the warlord's horn sounded the retreat, his forces were scattered like ash in the wind. The victory was not without cost. Many of the general's best fighters would not return from the high snowfields. Yet the enemy had been pushed back, their advance halted, at least for now. That night, as the campfires burned low, Hrothgar approached the general. "You fought like the wolf of old," he said, a rare smile on his weathered face. The general nodded, but said nothing. He could feel it. The battle was only a skirmish in a much larger war. The Black Wolf banners would return, and next time, they would not come alone. Somewhere beyond the Pale Pass, the warlord was gathering strength, and his eyes were fixed not only on Skyrim's borders, but on its heart. The wolf was at the gates, and if the gates fell, all the north would follow. The first sign came with the ravens, not the trained birds that carried messages between holds, but wild ones, black as the void and circling low over the eastern valleys. Hunters whispered that they gathered where blood was soon to be spilled. By the time the scouts returned, the whispers had become prophecy. The warlord had not retreated in defeat. He had coiled like a serpent, waiting for the frost to harden the ground. When the ice was thick enough to bear the weight of his war bands, they came, fast, silent, and in greater numbers than before. His black wolf banners moved with them like shadows cast by fire, cutting across the frozen plains toward Skyrim's heart. The attack began at dusk. Snow swirled under a bruised purple sky as horns blared from the south. The enemy struck 3 outposts at once, their warriors spilling through gaps in the defenses before alarm bells had even finished ringing. Fires rose in the distance, orange light flickering against the white hills. The general rode hard from the Pale Pass, the pounding of hooves a desperate drumbeat against the cold night. By the time he reached the first outpost, it was gone. The palisade lay broken, bodies strewn where they had fallen. There was no time to mourn. Messengers reported that the second outpost was still holding, though the fighting was fierce. When the general arrived, he saw the snow already crimson, churned by boots and blades. The enemy had brought war dogs, massive beasts armored in steel, their snarls cutting through the clash of steel. The defenders fought with the fury of cornered wolves, every arrow and sword stroke buying another heartbeat of resistance. The general led the countercharge himself, cutting a path through the enemy line. For a moment, victory seemed possible. The enemy began to falter under the combined assault of archers from the walls and the general's vanguard pushing from within. Then the warlord appeared. He was taller than most Nords, broad as a gate, his armor blackened and marked with the crimson wolf. In one hand he wielded a war axe, in the other a spiked shield. He fought not like a brute, but with a precise, ruthless rhythm. Each strike placed to kill, each movement conserving strength. Wherever he passed, the defenders fell back. The general met him near the shattered gate. Their weapons clashed, the sound ringing over the battle. The warlord's blows were heavy, but the general matched them, his defense unyielding. Snow fell thicker now, settling on armor and melting into steam on the heat of their breath. For a dozen strikes they circled, testing each other's skill, until the warlord stepped back, not in weakness, but in recognition. "This is not the day," the warlord said, his voice deep and calm. He gave a sharp whistle, and his warriors began to withdraw in disciplined ranks. The general let them go, knowing pursuit through the storm would be suicide. When the last black wolf banner vanished into the snow, the silence felt heavier than the battle itself. The ground was littered with the fallen, their blood seeping into the frost. The survivors stood in weary lines, watching the horizon as if expecting the enemy to return at any moment. That night, the longhouse was filled with the smell of pine smoke and the low murmur of voices. Hrothgar slammed his mug on the table. "He's testing us. Next time, it will be for keeps." The general stared into the fire. The warlord had looked into his eyes and seen something worth remembering. That meant the next battle would not be a raid. It would be a reckoning. Beyond the walls, the snow kept falling, covering the scars of the day. But beneath that white blanket lay the truth. War had come to stay, and it would write its history in red. 3 days after the battle at the second outpost, the wind carried the smell of pine, smoke mixed with something heavier, burnt flesh. Scouts returned with grim tidings. The warlord's host had split into smaller forces, striking deep into Skyrim's valleys, torching villages and stealing supplies before the winter tightened its grip. It was not a war of conquest yet. It was a war of erosion, chipping away at the kingdom's strength until the walls themselves would crumble under the weight of exhaustion. The general knew that if they allowed this to continue, spring would come too late to save the people. In the war council, maps lay spread across the long table, marked with ink and charcoal. "He will come for Solitude," one commander said. "Its harbor feeds the coast. Take it, and the rest of the north will starve." Another shook her head. "No, the warlord thinks like a wolf. He will circle the herd until it runs. Solitude will be the last strike, not the first." The general listened, silent. His thoughts were not on Solitude, but on a different threat, one that lay not in the warlord's army, but within the kingdom's own court. The High King had fallen ill weeks before the raids began, his presence at the council reduced to a pale figure on a throne, speaking little and moving less. Rumors whispered that some sought to take advantage of his weakness. That night, the general visited the king in his private chambers. The air was heavy with the scent of herbs, and the king's once proud frame seemed smaller beneath the furs. His eyes, however, still carried the sharp light of a hawk. "You've seen it," the king said without preamble. "Not just the warlord's game, but the vultures in my own hall. When I am gone, they will fight over the crown like dogs over a bone. Skyrim will tear itself apart before the enemy lifts another sword." The general felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders. "Then we must name your heir before that day comes." The king's gaze did not waver. "You will help him, or her, whoever it is. For the crown is not just gold and authority. It is the spine of the realm. Break it, and we are nothing but clans and ashes." The next morning, the king summoned a formal court. Lords, jarls, and captains gathered under the high beams of the great hall. The war banners of every hold hung above them, bright against the gray stone. The announcement struck like a hammer on iron. The king would pass the crown to his niece, a young woman of fierce reputation but little political backing. The room erupted, some in support, others in outrage. Old rivalries flared, accusations flew, and the hall nearly split in two. The general stepped forward, his voice carrying over the din. "This is not the time for division. The enemy stands at our gates. If you cannot stand behind your queen, then you're already siding with the warlord." Silence fell, brittle and sharp. The lords knew the truth in his words, even if they resented hearing it. That night, the crown was set upon the niece's brow in a ceremony stripped of grandeur by the urgency of war. She stood tall, the torchlight glinting off the silver circlet, her jaw set with the determination of one who knows the path ahead will be nothing but blood and frost. From the battlements, the general watched the horizon. Somewhere beyond the snow-laden hills, the warlord prepared his next strike. But now, there was a crown upon a head willing to risk all to defend it. The last crown had been chosen, not in peace, but in the shadow of the storm, and it would either hold the realm together or be buried with it beneath the winter snow. The snows fell heavier than in any winter the old hunters could remember. They whispered that Kine herself had taken to the skies, shaking her furs to bury the land in white, as if to slow the tread of marching feet. But not even the gods could halt the warlord's advance. From the western passes, his banners crept like stains of shadow across the pristine snow, each black pennant marked with the red sigil of a snarling wolf. Villages were already ash behind him. The scouts brought word. The main force would reach the high valley before nightfall. If they broke through there, the road to solitude would lie open. Queen Elenia, still new to the crown, yet standing as though she had worn it all her life, called for every able sword to muster at Frostwall Keep. The general rode at the head of the assembled host, his armor rimed with frost, his breath steaming in the bitter air. The drums of the enemy could already be felt in the earth, dull and steady as a heartbeat. Frost Wall stood like a stone tooth above the valley, its walls old but unbroken. In the courtyard, the queen addressed the warriors. "Tonight, we are not from this hold or that clan. We are Skyrim, and if Skyrim is to see another dawn, we will make our stand here." Her voice carried in the still air, steady as the mountains themselves. When the first wave came, it was not with a roar, but with a grinding, deliberate push. Shields locked. The warlord's vanguard drove into the snow like a black tide. Arrows hissed from the ramparts, finding gaps in armor. Stones and oil followed. Still they climbed, step by bloodied step, until the fighting reached the gate. At the heart of the fray, the general's sword moved like a living thing, each strike cutting a path through the crush of bodies. But for every foe cut down, two more pressed forward. The warlord himself was not yet seen, only his captains, snarling and shouting commands. It was then that the queen ordered the gates thrown open. It was madness, yet it worked. The enemy, thinking the defenders broken, surged inward. But within the narrow throat of the entryway, they found not retreating soldiers, but an unyielding wall of shields. The queen herself stood among them, her spear leveled. The clash was deafening. Snow turned to mud beneath the trampling of boots, then to red slush as the fighting dragged on. When at last the warlord appeared, he came clad in blackened steel, a great axe in his hands. He cut through men like wind through dry grass, his eyes fixed on the queen's silver crown. The general intercepted him, their weapons meeting with a thunderous crack. The duel was brutal, fought not with elegance but with the raw weight of survival. The warlord's strength was monstrous, yet the general moved with the precision of decades in battle. A feint, a pivot, a final thrust, steel met flesh, and the warlord fell to his knees, the snow beneath him blooming crimson. Silence rippled outward from that moment. Leaderless, the enemy faltered. By dawn, they were driven back into the passes, leaving only the dead to keep vigil in the valley. In a quiet that followed, the queen walked the walls, looking out at the pale horizon. The general joined her, both knowing this victory was not the end, only a pause before the next storm. Yet for now, the crown of winter still shone in the light of a sun struggling to pierce the clouds. "Skyrim stands," the queen said softly. "Aye," the general replied, though his eyes lingered on the far peaks. But for how long? The wind carried no answer. Only the whisper of snow over stone, a reminder that in this land, nothing endured forever save the mountains.